In today's new episode of Missing, we speak with old friend Sarah Cailean about her new podcast, Who Took Misty Copsey? And this is the third season, third investigation that she has done on this same podcast feed, but you can find it now by searching Who Took Misty Copsey? Misty Copsey is missing and has been since September 17th, 1992, and she went missing from Tacoma, Washington. And Sarah tells us all about this case. Lance, what do you think of this conversation?
It's great to reunite with Sarah. She is such a great investigator, former law enforcement, and she's turned into this remarkable podcaster. She had a show that folks might remember, Why Can't We Talk About Amanda's Mom, which was unbelievable. If you haven't listened to that, please go and check that show out. Who Took Misty Copsey is right up there with that show as far as quality goes. Her investigation and the compassion that she brings to the conversation is one of the highlights, in my opinion. Misty was only 14 years old when she disappeared, so this is one that has that extra layer of tragedy on it because you have this young woman who never really fulfilled anything in her life because of these circumstances.
And if you have any information in the disappearance of Misty Copsey, you can call the Puyallup Police Department at 253-770-3343. And we also just got to let you know some of the audio in this conversation, especially on Sarah's end, was a little bit distorted, and you can hear that in the conversation. So it's not great, but bear with us a little bit. The information is great.
And if you're listening to this on the release day, it is Christmas Day, so we wanted to wish everybody a happy holiday. We want to thank everybody for listening. We appreciate you all so much. Have a great holiday with your family, your friends. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you in the new year.
Absolutely. Happy holidays to all of our wonderful listeners out there. Thanks a lot for sticking with us. And we may replay a few episodes from the year, maybe some Crawlspace episodes here on Missing as we turn the page into 2026. So thank you very much for sticking with us. We really appreciate it. And please follow us on social media at Missing CSM.
All right, we're going to break real quick for commercial, and we'll be back with our friend Sarah Cailean to speak about Misty Copsey.
Welcome back to the podcast, Sarah Cailean. Sarah, how are you today?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you so much for having me back.
Yes, anytime. It's been far too long. And yay, you're back, and you're back with an amazing project. We actually just spoke for about a half hour before we started recording, so it was really cool to catch up. But I'm sure there's maybe a couple people who don't know who you are. Would you mind introducing yourself or reintroducing yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I agree, it has been far too long. I've missed you guys, so I'm really glad to be back. My name is Sarah Cailean. I am a cold case homicide investigator and criminal behaviorist. The old term that we don't really use anymore is profiler, but that's essentially what it is. I work primarily cold case homicides with what we call serial features.
So you have been producing seasons of shows, investigations, and they're really incredible. We spoke with you about your first season a couple of years ago, and now you're back with another series, Who Took Misty Copsey? And it is riveting and such an interesting case. Can you tell us a little bit about Misty Copsey?
I have, over the last 4 years, produced and hosted 3 podcasts in partnership with ID and ARC Media that follow me through essentially an actual cold case homicide investigation. The first season you guys were talking about was Why Can't We Talk About Amanda's Mom? And then the second season was Who Killed Jennifer Judd? And this third season is Who Took Misty Copsey? Misty was an absolutely incredible 14-year-old girl, just a ton of fun by all accounts from everybody who was around her. Really, really, really sweet, really funny, just a good kid all the way around. I'm a mom. I survived the teen years, but I can say that, some people have a harder time with their kids in the teen years because they're difficult, or they're, too emotional or too hormonal or all of that stuff. But in this case, Misty was almost as sort of low maintenance a kid as a parent could dream for. There were not, indications of behavioral problems, or anything of the sort. And I say all this not to say that she is a more worthy case to pursue because of that, not by any stretch. Who follow my cases know that I am always interested in understanding the complexities of human beings, no matter how they are sort of perceived by the outside world. But in Misty's case, the reason that is relevant is that she went missing in September of 1992. She had gone to the state fair with her best friend, Trina, and the two of them left the fair that night. They parted ways. Trina had a curfew. She went home, and Misty was supposed to get the bus home and just never made it home. She was never seen again after Trina left her outside of the fair. And again, the reason that it's relevant, her history as being a pretty obedient kid, a pretty well behaved kid, is that for nearly 6 months, the police, this is Puyallup, Washington, about 45 minutes or an hour outside of Seattle. The police at the time in 1992 insisted, against all proof and in spite of everything her parents were saying, that she was a runaway, that she was kind of, shacking up with somebody in a city out of state, or like they had all of those excuses that we have come to expect almost from cases of missing kids in the 70s, 80s, and into the early 90s. And that just was not the case. And her mother spent months, screaming from the rooftops, this kid did not run away. We had, she's a single mom, but they had a good relationship. They had, Misty had a stable home, great grades. There was just nothing to indicate that the runaway theory made any sense. But the police just kept digging their heels in. They would not hear otherwise. Until about 5 months after Misty disappeared, when some of her clothing was found balled up in the dirt on the side of the road, next to a ditch, essentially on the side of the road of a highway, miles and miles and miles from home, about 40 minutes from where she lived, and in completely the wrong direction to have gone home from the fair. The clothes were recovered, but Misty has still never been found herself. And at that point, the police then began to treat it, seriously as a missing, endangered, or possible homicide. Couple of things that are relevant here was that the clothing was found squarely in the center of an area that was known to be a primary dumping ground for the Green River Killer. And he was active at the time. And so, it sort of, that entered the theory pool, as it were. There were also 2 other girls from her hometown, from Puyallup, who had gone missing a couple of years earlier, with about 2 years in between each one. And both of those girls' remains were recovered, but they were recovered almost on top of each other, about 100 yards in the woods from where Misty's clothes were found on the side of the road. So there were all these theories, spilling about, but that really, from that point in February of 1993 up to today, is where the investigation has been trying to catch up with what was lost in those initial 5 months when the police just were not treating it as a missing, endangered kid.
Well, given your background in law enforcement, I personally can't stand it when we hear these stories and we hear that police absolutely insist on one thing when everybody around them saying, can you just look into this alternative? And then they keep insisting that it's a runaway and she's shacking up with somebody. Like, has that ever even happened? I don't even, you don't hear about those stories because those people are found and those stories don't make big media news. So I guess it does happen. But what was it about this one? What was it about Misty that they were looking at and they were just so absolutely convinced that it caused them to not look in any other direction? It's crazy.
Yeah, I'm pretty baffled by it myself, in how often that was the excuse. I mean, we would see it sometimes in cases with kids as young as 7 or 8, where it's like, really, this kid wandered off and is so far from home that they can't be found. We could do a whole show. We could do a whole season of a show on the psychology and the policies of law enforcement at the time, and how these mistakes were made. In Misty's case, it's difficult to say because we weren't able to speak with the original detective on the case. We did reach out to him. He was not interested in participating, and that's fine. But by all accounts, and just sort of my own interpretation of reading both the press accounts and what I have seen from the original case files, which is not a ton, but what I have seen and notes made by this detective, what it seems to me is that this detective, and then that kind of seeped into the rest of the law enforcement community, was he had a real bias against the mother. The mother, Diana Smith, was she was fiercely advocating for her daughter at the time, and which, as any parent, or really most people, understand today. But there was something about her. He made assumptions about her life, about her lifestyle. He just, for whatever reason, did not like mom, did not like Diana Smith, and that bled into everything that he was doing. That's sort of my own opinion on it. That there was this sort of need to punish Diana, for being so assertive. And she could, I mean, again, humans are complex. And there were times she would call him up, this detective, kind of like late at night, and berate him and say, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? And again, I can see both sides of that story, having been, I am a mother, but also I've been in law enforcement, in some capacity or another for almost 30 years now. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether or not you like this woman. She is not the one who you're supposed to be trying to protect right now. You're supposed to be looking for the kid. And what's more, if she was the one you were supposed to be protecting, these sorts of issues should not matter. Everybody is entitled to fair protection and equal protection, by the police, by their public servants. And it just didn't happen. And I think a lot of it was, she's a single mom. She, at that point, was living in a duplex. She had saved up and worked incredibly hard to move them into this, a nicer duplex. But prior to that, they were living in a trailer park. And I think there were just, prejudices developed early about mom, and they just dug their heels in from that point on.
So what were the circumstances of Misty's disappearance? Who was she with that day and evening?
So she was with, her best friend. They had been best friends for years, going back to elementary school, named Trina. Trina, they were in the same grade. Trina was a few months older. So Trina was 15, Misty was 14. And they had, they were planning to go to the fair. This is the Washington State Fair. It's a huge deal every year. It's still a huge deal every year. Over the course of the month that the fair runs, there are hundreds of thousands of people come through this little town of Puyallup, Washington, where the fair is headquartered. And so, it's a big deal for all the kids at school. They all get passes to the fair, stuff like this. And so she and Trina had been planning this for, probably for weeks, but really the plan for that particular day, it was a Thursday, September 17th. That plan had been set into motion earlier in the week. And at the time that the plan was conceived of by Trina and Misty, they wanted to go after school. They get out of school, 2:30, 3 o'clock, whatever it is. They want to go after school. They want to stay at the fair and then maybe spend the night at Misty's house afterwards. Well, the hiccup comes in because Diana, Misty's mom, worked nights. She was an elder care nursing assistant, and she, at that time, was taking care of one dementia patient, Alzheimer's patient, essentially, and she was the overnight caregiver. And so she told the girls, I can take you, I can drop you off at the fair, but you're going to have to find another way, to get home. And they're 14, 15-year-old girls. I absolutely was, staying home alone at that age. I think most people were. So it wasn't an issue that they were going to be alone at the condo at night. But it was about how are they going to get there, because the condo was actually in Spanaway, which is another town. It's about 10 miles away from Puyallup. And so there were some different ideas hatched. So the initial idea that was told to Diana, and this, again, you can be the best kid in the world and every teenager lies to their parents. It just is a fact of life. We've all been teenagers. Some of us have had teenagers. What Misty and Trina told Diana was they had looked up the bus schedules. They had gone to the library or whatever they need to do to get bus schedules at the time before we had the internet. And they had found the right bus that would pick them up at the fair and drop them off in Spanaway, close enough to home to walk the rest of the way. And Diana said, okay, she agreed to this plan. This was the first time she was letting them, go off and do something like this by themselves. And to be clear, Trina was a fixture in the household as well. Trina was, at that point being cared for by a kind of a foster parent. She had a much more unstable home life. And so she had really become sort of a second daughter to Diana and almost like a sister to Misty. So they did everything together. But the plan that the girls had actually come up with was to call a young man who they both knew, they did not know well, a guy named Reuben Schmidt. And Reuben was 18. He was still in high school, but he was 18. He had a car, and he had for months been crushing on Misty, sort of pursuing her, again, 14. And Diana was very uncomfortable with Reuben. Diana had overheard some phone conversations, when she could pick up the line, because again, this is, the 90s. Those of us Gen Xers remember this, where your parents could eavesdrop on your phone calls simply by picking up a line in the house. And Diana had heard him say some, what she considered kind of foul stuff from an 18-year-old to a 14-year-old about, making him horny and stuff. And Misty was uncomfortable with this too, to be clear. Misty was kind of out of her depth with a guy like this. But I think, again, I was a 14-year-old girl. And in fact, when I was a 14-year-old girl, I had a crush on an 18-year-old boy named Jeff. And if Jeff had said, I can give you a ride home, I absolutely would have done it. And I was a straight A student, didn't get in trouble, didn't mess with boys really. But, this was exciting. And I think, again, these kids were just out of their depth. We have no frontal lobe development by that age, and just, made some poor choices. So they told Diana after the fair, they left the fair, they called Diana and said, we missed the bus. And maybe at some point there was a plan to take the bus. But what Trina remembers is that we were always supposed to get a ride with Reuben. We had arranged that earlier in the week. So they call Reuben from a payphone. And Reuben tells them, no, I can't come get you. My girlfriend is here, his girlfriend at the time being 13. My girlfriend is here. She doesn't want me to come, and I don't have any gas. And Misty says, Trina has money. If you can get here, we will give you gas money. You told us you were going to pick us up. We're stuck at the fair now. And he says, nope, I'm not doing it. So they make a couple of other calls. They call Diana, and Diana is understandably upset. She's like, you told me you had this squared away. She's like, I can't leave. I cannot leave this elder dementia person alone. And she's like, try some other people. Call your grandma, call some other people. And they do. They call a few other people. Trina ends up securing a ride with another older boy who she had been hanging out with. I mean, not a boy. He was 22 or 23 years old, a guy named Michael Reiner. No hero in this story, but not, ultimately who took Misty. And Misty did not like him. Again, this just sort of goes to, she doesn't trust him. She doesn't think he's a good dude. She doesn't really like Trina hanging out with him. But Trina is now getting worried that she's going to get in trouble at home for not being home. And Misty says, go with Michael. I'll find a way home. Trina gives her the money that she has left. Trina had $10 cash, and she gives it to her and says, try and get Reuben to come get you. You can give him this money. So Trina leaves. It's now, 9:40-ish, something like this. It is dark. It is, it's not great. It's not a great scenario. So she calls Reuben again and says, please come get me. And I can even tell you how to break into my house, because he lived very close to her condo. She says, I can tell you where the key is. There's money in my room. You can have that. She's like, I've got money from Trina. You can have that. Just please come get me. And that is where the stories begin to differ.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
There are people who say, and in the early days, people told Diana that Ruben said to them, I'm going to pick up Misty. Ruben himself, though, when he is finally questioned by the police, which again was not initially, but when he's finally questioned by the police, he says, no, I did not. I didn't have gas money. My girlfriend was there and she was mad and I never went to go pick her up. They interview, at that time, Ruben was kind of crashing at a friend's house. They interview the friend who was also 14 years old. And he says, he left to go get Misty. And then when they interview him a second time, he says, I must have had that information wrong. He did not leave to go get Misty. Well, any dummy can put this together as like this 18-year-old kid got to the 14-year-old kid in the meantime. But that is not what the police believe. And just to kind of, sum up the next 30 years, they did interview Ruben a couple of times. They looked at some other suspects. They were able to rule out a number of other suspects. Ultimately, they polygraphed Ruben, and he had a very, very weird, you have to listen to the podcast to hear the whole thing, but he had a very weird polygraph result is what I'll say at this point. But they again, ultimately said, nope, he's excluded. He did not do this. And in the meantime, again, without giving you 8 episodes of a podcast in this interview, he made some interesting statements, not just in the immediate aftermath, but in the years afterwards. And so that is kind of where the podcast starts, is like, let's revisit some of the people who were suspects. Let's take my skill set and try and identify if there are some other suspects who haven't been looked into. And let's see where we end up, with the ultimate goal of, yes, bringing somebody to justice, but even more so for the sake of her family, what their wishes have never veered from, is to bring her home, to have her remains located and have them, reunited with her family so that her family could have a resting place to go spend time with her. Diana passed away in 2020. So she never got to see Misty brought home. After Misty disappeared, Diana had a second child. She had a son named Colton. Colton is now 27. And Colton, grew up his whole life knowing that he had this older sister who was gone, who had been murdered, as far as his mom believed, and that this was sort of a fight that he helped her participate in every way he could. And after Diana passed, right away, he wasn't really sure how to carry that mantle, because he was just, desperately sad at the loss of his mother. They were very close. But at some point he said, if I don't keep this going, literally nobody will. Because at that time, the police were not really doing anything about it anymore. They had reopened the case between 2009 and 2011, and they did some incredible work. The investigator who took charge of the case at that time was a guy named Jason Bisnaugh, who is now a captain with the agency. And I just have the utmost respect for Captain Bisnaugh. I think he's a good human and a good detective. But unfortunately, there were so many mistakes made in 1992 and 1993 that it's very difficult to recover from those in an investigation, and particularly with a no-body homicide. And so it had, after, Captain Bisnaugh, eventually, they pulled him off of full-time duty on Misty's case, which he did for several years. That was his full-time job, was working the Misty Copsey case. And he, was promoted through the ranks and stuff. And there were detectives assigned to it, according to Diana's statements from the time and from Colton's experience in the years after he kind of took the torch. They were not working it in a way that the family felt was appropriate or sufficient. And so Colton, when I reached out to him, he was initially skeptical, because there have been some podcasts, some media around it that got a lot of details wrong. And so he's very guarded about that and being protective of that. But ultimately, he actually spoke with a family member from my season 2 series, who had gone through a similar experience where he had been, there was sort of one type of treatment from the media about that case for a long time, and then ultimately agreed to work with me and found that, I tried to treat him and the victim, with respect and care. And so that person convinced Colton to participate. And we've actually formed, a great, I think, care for each other, but also just mutual respect about working this case and bringing Misty home to him. In the course of the time that I was working the case, I began working on Misty's case, essentially from the outside. The police department have been very cooperative as far as giving us interviews on the record and stuff. But they, unlike, a number of other agencies that I've worked with on these types of investigations, they opted to not, bring me in as an actual consultant on the case, which is fine. I respect that. I get that. It's, I had hoped for otherwise, but I understand their position. But in the months that, in the immediate months after I started working on that case, a new detective was assigned. Her name is Jordan Wicks. She is the first female investigator to even look at this case, really. And I have over the last couple of months been, spending a lot of time interacting with Detective Wicks and sharing information that I was able to develop that they did not have. And I can say with confidence, I believe this case is going to be solved, and I believe that Detective Wicks is going to be the one at the top of that. She is one of the best investigators I've ever met. And her instincts are good. Her training is good. Her skill set is phenomenal. I think she's gonna be able to close this out. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I mean, we never ever want to make promises like that on any case, but especially not a cold case. But I've rarely had as much confidence in an investigator at an agency with one of these cases as I have in Detective Wicks.
Well, that's great to hear. It's always good when the new regime comes in and they're very capable.
I just want to say, sorry, to give credit where credit is due.
Yeah.
She was assigned the case by Captain Visnaw. So he has continued to care about this case and to want it closed. And he can't do it anymore, but he assigned somebody, and I believe he tapped the right person.
So you said that Ruben had taken a polygraph test and his answers were a little weird. Michael Reiner also took a polygraph test, I believe. Can we get into a little bit of his past? Because like you said, he's no hero in the story. He's not a villain. I don't know, but he does have.
He's
sort
a
of
villain. He's just not a villain in this story, really.
Exactly.
I mean,
yeah. Can we open this up a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. There were some things that we don't say in the official podcast, which is understandable, that large networks are averse to saying things for fear of lawsuits. I quite frankly don't have anything, so you can come after me. He has been accused of sexual assault on minors. He has, and that is something that has been investigated and ultimately not prosecuted to the fullest extent. But I believe the accusations, everything about them points to credibility. In addition to that, there are things we do know for a fact, such as he was a almost mid-20s dude who was for lack of a better term, dating 15-year-old Trina. Trina speaks at length about what she now, as a woman in her late 40s, recognizes as grooming at the time. I mean, it is textbook. So, and that there were others. She was not the only 14, 15-year-old girl with whom he was having sexual relations, which we now understand in most states with that age difference, it's classified as rape. Like whether or not the victim is stating the words of consensual behavior or engaging in what appears to be consensual behavior by law, because the law finally recognizes that children of that age are not capable of making of not giving consent as we understand it in adulthood. He could have been prosecuted many times over for things that we do know for a fact had they, taken place in today's light. So yeah, again, come for me, Michael. I really, I could not be less afraid of him, either financially or, in any other way. I don't think it will matter. I don't think he will, I don't think he cares. I can't imagine he cares what people think. If you're 22, 23 and regularly dating children, obviously you don't have a lot of concern for what the world thinks of you. but he was eliminated as a suspect in this case, which is fair. There was one incident, I believe, where he had sort of physically coerced a minor into a car, and then this was that sexual assault allegation, and then sexually assaulted her, and so it kind of you look at it and you're like, oh my god, this sure seems like a possible, but they were able to alibi him out, essentially, partly through Trina, but through some other stuff as well. And again, Trina is not calling him a hero in this case at all, but just again that like she can say unequivocally that he did not return and pick up Misty from the fair.
What's happening here? What's happened in this town? Why are young men having relationships with 13 and 14-year-olds? Because Ruben had a 13-year-old girlfriend that he couldn't leave to go pick. What is going on?
To go pick up the 14-year-old he hopes will become his girlfriend.
Yeah, like were there no one within their age range in Puyallup?
No, of course there were people within their age range. People like Ruben and Michael. This is not an accident. This is not a lack of accessibility to girls or women their own age. This is a sexual preference that both the law and science recognize as wrong. I mean, that's not exactly a scientific word or a legal word, but we recognize it as a type of sexual preference that is deviant, and that this is. I was probably only a couple years older than Misty. Let me see. So 92, Misty was 14. I turned 18 in the fall of 92. So I lived through this era as well. And I've talked to so many of my friends, women my age. I don't know a woman my age who doesn't have at least one story about a teacher at their school getting in trouble for dating a student, right? Not necessarily getting fired, certainly not going to jail, but this sort of like these open secrets, at my school, it was Coach Clifford, the football coach, was known to have affairs with girls at school. Affairs, again, air quotes. Boy, I'm really getting myself into all kinds of hot water right now. But like every girl I know, and a lot of the guys I know in that era, this stuff was frowned upon, but not necessarily treated the same way we now hopefully are treating it. So 18-year-olds dating 14-year-olds, 13 years old, it might have been, there were parents who probably found a way to completely prevent it. Misty's mom certainly tried. She tried to make Ruben, no, this is not an option. I don't want you around him. And again, teenagers are going to do what teenagers do. And because there's just this lack of judgment, she had no idea this sort of like den of snakes that were around him, that she was just kind of too sweet and naive of a kid to recognize how dangerous he could have been. But yeah, no, this was happening all the time. This was not unfortunately local to Puyallup. This was commonplace for 18, 19-year-olds to be dating 13, 14-year-olds.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Now, it really stood out that Ruben claimed that he had a blackout. And I believe it was the next day after he had, driven Misty or not driven Misty. But then he woke up miles away,
yes,
which was a very interesting part in the podcast because it was Yeah, because he didn't have gas money or gas the night before, but he did the next day.
Well, no, it's that night of. So Ruben acknowledged at the time, and in a way has never completely disputed it. Again, when you listen, you'll get an understanding of why I kind of hedge these things. He said he went out to his family's farm, his grandparents' farm, which again is about 40 miles away. It is extremely remote. The word farm often, it conjures like, large areas of flat land with either, plants growing on it or animals or whatever. What this really was a homestead in the mountains, and it is extremely mountainous. It is extremely wooded, like heavily wooded. And this was a family property, and it was a close family. They spent a lot of time out there. And so Reuben would later say he went to the farm, his grandparents' farm, that night or early the next morning, but he couldn't really remember because he has these blackouts, and he couldn't remember driving out there. He doesn't know how he got there, not really sure how he got back, but that, yes, he acknowledges he was out there, which means, of course, that somebody must have told someone he was out there. The blackout thing is, they all think that they're clever when they come up with this, but it is something that has been attempted over and over throughout the years, that somebody will say that they had a blackout and don't know what happened, and that explains any gaps in their ability to alibi themselves, or why they were or weren't where they said they were. And that's sort of a story he has stuck to, that he doesn't know how he got out there with no gas money, but that he is certain that he was there both as an alibi for when he would have been picking Misty up, supposedly, or a way to, I don't know, explain his absence when other people were saying he was not at the house that he said he was at with the girlfriend. And it's bullshit. Sorry. It's never, these guys always do this, and it never turns out to be true that they have any history of blackouts or fugue states or any of this. And it did not, Reuben never had one before, and he never had one after. It was just an awfully convenient night to have a blackout the night that a child goes missing.
And also these fugue states, you can't really medically prove that they happened or not, right? It's not like they were going to do a CAT scan or something, or an MRI of his brain.
Right. Certainly not at that time. That was a time when we still sort of believed in stuff like, split personalities and everything, which, again, we do not believe in now. We now recognize certain elements of those markers as, identity disorders or fugue states. And a fugue state essentially is kind of a blackout. It's where you are not operating under your own control, where you are awake and moving around and doing things, but you're kind of in a fog, and you don't remember much the next day, or whenever you come out of it. But yeah, they're extremely difficult to test for in any way. And at that time, they wouldn't have begun to know how to test for something like that. It is also, though, historically, people do experience fugue states, particularly people with a history of trauma. But it is something that will exhibit in their lives a lot more often than just one convenient night.
Right. Wow. That is such an interesting part. And now, at the end of the 8 episodes, you are investigating a property of interest. Can you tell us a little bit about this investigation and what led you to this location?
So the location that we're investigating late in the series, where we're actually digging in the dirt, is the Schmidt family farm. It is this homestead in the woods and the mountains. It is no longer owned by the Schmidts. About 6 years ago, an absolutely lovely couple named Aaron and Lindsay bought it. They were a young couple. They're going to have their family here. They're going to actually try and turn immediate acreage right around the house into a working farm. And they're just like the sweetest, most wonderful humans. And so I reached out to them and said, I don't know if you're aware that this thing has happened to this girl, near-ish by in Puyallup. And there are some theories that her remains could be located on your property. How would you feel about us coming and digging up your yard? Not just randomly, testing holes in the yard. There were some anonymous tips that I received, some of which do not even make it into the podcast. It's difficult to try and keep a series like this, bring the listener in as much as possible, but also protect the integrity of the investigation, and protect people in the periphery of the investigation. And so there were tips that we received that identified some interesting points. And so I went out there with a woman named Marian Davidson, who is, she sort of has two specialties. She is a forensic anthropologist, but also a forensic archaeologist. And her area of specialty is identifying and locating clandestine graves, essentially. Places where it's like, oh, nobody knew that there were remains there. She's worked on cases where they're recovering World War II pilots from the forests in Cyprus and stuff like this. It's an incredible area of expertise. I work with her on a lot of cases. She's a member of a cold case consultation group that I formed with Dr. Ann Burgess a few years ago. So I asked Marian if she would be willing to help me try and sort through some different places that we'd received tips on for Misty's remains. And she said, tell me when, tell me where, I will be there. And so that's what you get to kind of join in on as Marian and I are digging in very rocky dirt. It is very rocky. Washington is very rocky.
Okay, can you tell us a little bit about how this may or may not, or at least a theory that revolves around the disappearances of Anna Shebetnoy and Kimberly DeLange?
Okay, so earlier when I mentioned that Misty's clothes were found about 100 yards from where the remains of two other girls have been found, that is Anna Shebetnoy and Kim DeLange. So, Misty goes missing in 1992. In 1988 and 1990, Anna went missing and Kim went missing. They were ultimately found. They were both located, but they were not located at the same time, but they were both located in this same spot. I mean, almost like, the second set of remains were found almost in the exact same spot as the first set of remains, about 100 yards deeper into the woods from where Misty's clothes were found. And both of these girls had gone missing from Puyallup, Washington, from essentially the same main drag that runs through Puyallup Meridian Ave. They were a couple of miles away from where Misty went missing at the fairgrounds, but both Kim and Anna went missing from the same shopping mall, but again, 2 years apart from each other. And their remains were found in the same place. So it certainly does appear that Kim and Anna's cases are linked. Everything I have examined, with what I have access to, because again, I don't have the whole case file, but with what I can say from the outside and what I have seen, I do not believe that their cases are linked to Misty's case. I think that was either pure coincidence or that whoever took Misty in 1992 kind of thought, let's dump some of her stuff near where Kim and Anna were found, because those were highly publicized cases in the area, and everybody will assume that they were connected to that.
And that would assume that the person who did this to Misty kept some of her stuff and then had this thought after the fact, which I'm sure might go a long way when some answers come up, right? Because doesn't that show some sort of premeditation or some sort of deliberate, I don't know,
You mean as far as dumping the clothes?
Yeah. They would have to have had that on their person until they made the decision to go dump them in an area where it would make it look like she was part of another set of disappearances.
Yes, it would. It would indicate premeditation of how to cover up the crime. It would not necessarily indicate premeditation of the crime itself. Yeah. I'm not, again, because I don't have the case files, I can't rule that out. The circumstances that I am aware of, again, I do not believe that is what had happened here, that this was, any kind of planning to take Misty and, assault and or murder her. I do believe that it probably mostly arose over the course of that evening, that night, in a relatively short period of time. But the fact is, whoever took her had almost 6 months to start covering their tracks before the police were even really looking for her. And so again, a lot of damage is done in that window of time where memories fade, witnesses are intimidated, and physical evidence is destroyed or hidden. And that's, or to your point, placed somewhere to deliberately mislead investigators. Because I don't think it's necessarily an accident either that the clothes were dumped. Really, I mean, when I say, I think there were like either 5 or 6 Gary Ridgway victims were located right within that same area. So it could be that they were like, oh, let's just dump them there and everybody will think the Green River Killer did it, which, for a while people did think so. It was the King County Sheriff's Office was the one responsible for the Green River investigation, and where the jeans were found, where Misty went missing from and where the jeans were found, and also this family farm are in Pierce County. But when the jeans were initially found, it was King County who came in and started an investigation because, it really did look like it could be connected to Ridgway. And then it was pretty quickly ruled out.
And were those clothes proven to be Misty's?
Oh, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? Without giving too much away, not too many spoilers, that was another facet of the investigation that I think probably caused some missteps and some significant loss of time as far as identifying a suspect. The police did not believe that they were Misty's clothes. And there's a whole host of reasons why. I think I have been able to pretty successfully debunk the biggest of the reasons why. I do believe they are Misty's clothes. I do believe, based on the statements from Trina, based on Diana's statements at the time, which we have since, I have a great forensic researcher, Jennifer Leahy, and she was able to identify the store where the jeans were bought in Tacoma. And, everything lines up with Diana's version of how these clothes would have gotten onto Misty's body that night. And Trina also said unequivocally at the time, and still today, that's what she was wearing. That's what she got changed into in the car. Like her mom, picked Trina up. Misty was already in the car. And then the girls got changed in the back seat into the clothes they wanted to wear to the fair. And Trina said, in no uncertain terms, those are the clothes she was wearing. And I believe that they are her clothes. I don't know how else to put it. So, but the police did dispute that for many, many years.
So we can't recommend the show enough. The show is called Who Took Misty Copsey, and you have 8 episodes, and you dig in. I mean, I guess that's why we love you as an investigator. We love you as a guest. You're an amazing human being because you go and you do these things, and you don't just look at it from the peripheral. You are on site and you are, like you said, digging in rocks to try to find something. That's really admirable. But where does it go from here? Where are you now, and what's going to happen moving forward with any developments that you can tell us here?
First of all, thank you very much for the kind words. It means more than you realize coming from you guys, because I know that you guys are also really diligent about doing work with as much integrity as possible in this space. And that is difficult. Not everything in the true crime space is done with advocacy in mind or with the right intentions. And so I'm always proud to be talking to you guys. The thing with all of my cases, and I do get a lot of questions about this on social media, when I take on a case, even if it's for a podcast, because I work a lot of cases that never, turn into podcasts or anything. I do a lot of casework. But even the ones that do end up in these investigative series, I have taken on the case. The podcast is just a feature. It's just a way that I can help get the case funded, stuff like that. These cases remain my cases. I am still working actively on Renee Bergeron's case from season 1, on Jennifer Judd's case from season 2. Both of those, we've had significant developments in the actual cases, and I believe we'll ultimately have solves in. But by nature of active investigations, it's also really important to protect the integrity of those cases. So as we get closer to a finish line, it is more imperative than ever that we're kind of playing things close to our vest. That being said, when we have information we can share, we will absolutely do so, because I do know that people are really invested in these victims and their loved ones as we're able to give them a platform. This holds true for Misty's case as well. I will say this, I have been back to Washington 3 times. And obviously, you heard me singing Detective Wicks's praises. I speak with her regularly, and I go out there regularly. And that is all I can say right now. In the event that there is something that we can break that is going to be, breaking news or whatever, we are doing everything in our power to make sure that I'm able to tell our listeners first.